Today's daf is daf nun vav. Hanodim in a bias. If he takes a neder not to enter into a house, mutar ba'aliyah, he's allowed to go up to the attic. The aliyah is not included in the definition of bias. And each one has a separate name. There's something called a bias, and there's something called an aliyah. So when he took a neder in a bias, he did not include the aliyah. Divrei Rabbi Meir. V'chachom omrim aliyah v'chlal bias. That aliyah is included in the bias. He's not allowed to go up to the aliyah, even though each one has a separate name. But people, when they speak about both a bias and the aliyah, they use the word bias. And that includes the aliyah as well. The aliyah is tafel to the bias. And now the flip side, hanodim in aliyah, mutar b'bias. Everybody agrees, even the Chachamim, that if he took a neder, that he wouldn't go into the aliyah, it means up to the attic, and that's the tafel. But he excludes the bias from his neder, therefore he's allowed to enter into the bias. The Gemara asks the following question: Man Tano, who is the Tano of our Mishnah that derives from the parasha of Nigei Batim of Tzoras Abayis, that we need a special ribui for the aliyah? And the pasuk says, "V'nosati nega tzoras bebeis eretz achuzaschem." And the word bebeis is coming l'rabos es ha savua. We'll see what savua means. And bebayis l'rabos es aliyah. Now savua, again, the girsa that we have is savua, and it means the kiros shenitzva'u. These are the walls of the house that were dyed, were painted, and they are included, even though they're painted, in the Negev Tzoras. Now the word Bebayis comes to include the Aliyah. Rav Chisda, Rabbi Meir, it cannot be the Chachamim. Rabbi Meir needs a special ribui for the Aliyah because his shita is that the word bias does not include Aliyah. And without this extra pasuk, we would not know that the tumah of the bias includes the Aliyah. Or, for example, if there are negoyim in the Aliyah, then the bias is declared to be tameh, is announced to be tameh. The Rabbanan says, Rav Chisda, if the Mishnah would be attributed to Rabbanan, or Amri, they hold that Aliyah b'chlal bias is lama likra bebeis liribui. Why do I need a special ribui to include the Aliyah? The word bias would have been sufficient, and bias includes the Aliyah. Abayom afilu temer Rabbanan, even if this brisa reflects the sheep of the Rabbanan, who maintain that Aliyah is included on the bias, nevertheless, by Christ, still need a special ribui. Why is that so? The Salka Daitachamina, I would have thought, if not for this ribui, that since it says the base Eretz Achuzaschem Ksiv, and the Torah means Eretz Achuzaschem, a bias that's Mechubar Bi'ara, it's connected to the ground. Shmei bias, then it's called a bias. But Aliyah, Holo Mechaber Bi'ara, it's not connected to the ground, it's connected to the bias, but not to the Ara. And therefore, the Rabbanan need the pasuk for bias as a ribui for Aliyah. Now the Gemara quotes a statement of Rav Huna, and it would seem from Rav Huna that with regard to Mekach u'Memkar, we do not consider Aliyah to be included on the bias, even according to the Chachamim. Keman azla had yom Rav Huna bar Chia mishmei de'ura. A person sells a bias to his friend, and at the time of the sale, he says the bias the basi. He has an extra word here, and he is marchid the lashon animochecha. Is then, because of the extra word, mar'eu aliyah, he can show him that I sold you the aliyah. Even though living in the aliyah is not up to par because it doesn't have the security of surrounding walls and a ceiling to make it comfortable like a bias, he can still say the mocher, my intention was to sell you the aliyah. So now the Gemara is medayik in the words of Rav Huna. The time or the reason why he can pawn him off with the aliyah, which is inferior to the bias, is given the amalei the bias should be basic. The extra language of bias should be basic indicates any bias within my house. Even the inferior bias, which is the aliyah. But if he would have said bias tam without any word of basi, eno mar'eu aliyah, lema Rabbi Meir. This would mean that bias does not include aliyah. If he sold him the bias, that's what they agreed on the sale, then it doesn't include the aliyah. Whereas the Rabbana would say that even if you only use the word bias in the sale, bias would be aliyah, would include the aliyah. He doesn't have to add bias to the basi in order to expand the scope of his machir to include the aliyah. The Gemara rejects. I feel repayment, even if you'll tell me that this distinction of Rav Huna between bias and bias of the basi is the Rabbanon is meant to satisfy the sheet of the Rabbanon, that when a person says bias stam, he can give him the aliyah. Nevertheless, Rav Huna adds the word bias of the basi. What did Rav Huna mean when he said bias of the basi, that he can show him the aliyah? It means ma'ula shebebatim. What Rav Huna has in mind is that aliyah doesn't mean the attic like we thought it meant, but it means the ma'ula shebebatim. He has to give the best house of his bias. He didn't say bebesi. If he would have said bebesi stam, then enochinami, we're going according to the Rabbanan, and besi stam includes the aliyah. But Rav Huna's case was when he said bias shebebesi animocho. I'm giving you the best bias of my house. And what does Rav Huna mean when he says mareu aliyah? Aliyah can't mean the attic because that's garua shebebesi. But he said bias shebebesi meaning the best house of my house, which is the aliyah, which means aliyah meaning the ma'ula shebebati. He didn't say bebesi. He means ma'ula shebebesi, the best of my house, which means the bias itself and not the aliyah. The Mishnah says, "I know them in amita muta b'dargash." So we're going to have a whole sugya what dargash is. Dargash is a kind of a bed that's not included under the term mita. Dargish is included under mita. So similar to what we saw before, Machlok Shim Rabbi Meir and Chachamim, as to whether or not bias includes aliyah, we have whether or not mita includes the dargish. And it's Rabbi Meir who says that we take the more narrow definition, and just like in the case of bias we exclude aliyah, so too in the case of mita we exclude dargish. And the Chacham take the broadest scope definition of the term, and therefore in the case of noder mina bias it includes even the aliyah, and noder mina mita includes even the dargish. However, the opposite around, Chachamim would concede that if he was noder mina dargish, then he's giving the tofel, and therefore muta b'mita. He deliberately used the term dargish to exclude mita. My dargish, the Gemara asks, what is a dargish? Omar Ula, Arsa Degada. Arsa Degada means that they would prepare a bayit in the house, a mita, perfectly set and organized, but no one would sleep there. And this is called a mita of mazel. Now, exactly how this mita of mazel brings good fortune to the house. So I'll read to you this comment here. He says that there's a sar, some sort of a heavenly officer, Memuna al Ashiris, in charge of wealth. And his name is Nakir. And if you are careful about keeping a very tidy house, then Nakir will bring Ashiris to the house. So in order to beautify the house, what they would, and satisfy Nakir, they would prepare a bed. No one would sleep on the bed. It would always be beautiful. It would always be Naki. You never had to change the sheets. And the sheep of Ubetzes adds here that this bed is l'chvodo shel makom. It is in honor of the Almighty, and it's very similar to the kisei of Elio at a bris milah, which is in honor of Elio and Navi. The question here that's addressed by the Achronim is why this is not considered Darkei Amori. Apparently, this was very common amongst the nations that occupied Palestine. After Ula defines Dargosh as Arsa Degado, the Rabbanim say, they raise the following objection: Hadisnan, what are we going to do with the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, which addresses the case of a melech, a king, who is sitting Shiva? He lost one of his close relatives. And after the burial, the first Seudah is called the Seudah Savra. And the Mishnah says, Kshay Mavrin also, Kol ha'om mesuben al oretz, for who mesav al adargosh. The people who come for the Seudah Savra, the close relatives or friends, they have to sit on the floor and they surround the melech after the levaya when they eat the Seudah Savra, who mesav al adargosh, but the melech himself is not sitting on the ground. They're mishtatif in his avelus by sitting on the ground, but he himself will eat the meal while he reclines on a dargosh. Now this makes no sense, according to Ula, because Kula Shaita Lo Yosef, well, the whole year they wouldn't sleep or sit on this couch on this dargosh, because it was designated for Mazel. And now Dafka Hahu Yoma, on the day of his avelus Yosef Allah, he's going to sit on this dargosh, on this mita that's designated not to be touched and to be exclusively designated for mazel. What sense does that make? The dafka during Avelus, which is a day in which a person is never in shiflus and achna and zifa, he's going to be sitting on a mita mechubedes. We should give him the most glorious bed in the house, the most glamorous bed, which is Ula's darga. So the Gemara now defends Ula and rejects the kasha against Ula. Maskif la Ravina, I'm going to accept Ula, the darga shizarsa degada. You'll ask me, why is the king sitting there dafka on the day of his avails? That's not a kasha. The boss of the ayi, the kula shaita, iboy ochel, iboy lo ochel. But during the entire course of the year, a person is either going to drink wine or eat meat, or he's not going to drink wine or eat meat. But Ahu Yom, on that day of his Avelus, we're going to give him meat and wine, and we're mechuyev to be miyashiv daito. We have to calm him down, because in a state of Avelus, a person doesn't have Yeshiva Das. And the Mishnah is based on a pasuk in Mishle that says Tnu Yain Lemori Nefesh. We give wine to those who are in a state of moris of nefesh, of avelus. So we give them like an extra pump up. We pump up their and console their grief by giving them meat and bosom, meat and yain. So too by the dargosh, even though the whole year round we wouldn't sleep on the dargosh or sit on the dargosh, on this day, in order to achieve yeshiva das, we're going to sit him on that dargosh. So don't reject the Ula, who says that the dargosh is that mita mechubedes the arsa the God. This reminds me, by the way, of the Yemenite minhag that with every day of Avelus, as we increase the days, we increase the numbers of cups of wine that they brought to the oven. Now Ravina continues. Ella, I do have a question to raise on Ula's interpretation. Ha kasha, this is the right kasha to ask. The Sanya, we learned in a brisa, with regard to an avil during Shiva, we have a mitzvah called Kfiyas HaMita, in which we turn upside down the mitos of the bias. And this is based on a Gemara in Moikot Daf Tes Vav, that during the Shiva Simei Avelus Chayovim Lahafoch Es Mitoso Milamal Lamata. So the foot of the bed, which normally goes down, is turned up. The chavolim and the strips of wood that they sleep on, he should not sleep on it on top of it, but rather turn it upside down. And he quotes a brisa in Moedkot B'tam Kfiyas HaMita. What's the meaning of this custom of turning the beds upside down? That the mita somehow reflects the tzelem elokim of a person, and at the time of his misa, his tzelem elokim, his countenance is marred, his face changes. Obviously, he no longer has the pink, fleshy color of the face. And the mita is the makom menucha shel adam. And that indicates their srora of the kavod. The opposite of srora of the kavod is misa. So we turn the beds upside down. And yet the Brisa says, Dargosh lo hayikol feil ezokva. The Dargosh, they wouldn't turn upside down, but rather they would stand it upright. Ma'amido al tzido. They put it on its two legs. Iyamrit arsa begadahu. If you're going to tell me that Ula is correct, and arsa, then, and what is Dargosh? It's an arsa, the gada, it's the mita suyula mazel. But Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, hakofes mitaso, when the Avil turns the bed upside down to fulfill the base Avil, lo mitaso lo vadu kofa, elakol mitos sheyesh lo v'socha bayisu kofa. He turns upside down even those mitos that he doesn't sleep in, which would imply that even the Dargosh, according to Ula's interpretation of Dargosh, that nobody sleeps in, should be turned upside down. So how do we reconcile that with the first brisa that says that Dargosh does not lend itself to the chiyuv, is not included in the chiyuv kfir? It must be, therefore, that Dargosh is not an arsa degada. And the Gemara now rejects Ravina's kasha. Ha lo kasha. This is not a valid objection.